Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this co-presentation by the Book Club of California, the Bibliographical Society of America, and the American Trust for the British Library. This is an in-person and virtual program titled Early English Books, Reading in the Time of Shakespeare. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and get this program started. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. And if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member or a donor. More information about the Book Club of California can be found at bccbooks.org. Now, in terms of logistics for tonight's program, we will have a presentation by our speaker and then a Q&A session immediately following. If you are out there on Zoom and you have questions or comments for our speaker, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We should have time at the top of the hour to take questions and comments, and we'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A. We will also take questions from our beautiful audience here in the club rooms. Now, again, as I said, tonight's presentation is the result of a collaboration between the Book Club of California, the American Trust for the British Library, and the Bibliographical Society of America. And now I'm pleased to introduce bibliophilic friend and colleague, Andrew Nadell, to tell you more about those organizations, our speaker, and our program this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We have a good turnout tonight, don't we? So this is the second in a series of book club events that are co-sponsored by the Bibliographical Society of America. The last one was in June last year in 2022, where Giles Mandelbrot, the librarian of the Lambeth Palace Library, who is now the librarian of the Warburg Institute, spoke in person. And we have two more coming up next month and in February. This time, and from now on, I hope we are being sponsored not only by the Bibliographical Society of America, where I'm privileged to be on the council, but also by the American Trust for the British Library. The Bibliographical Society of America, as you all know, is a very old, in fact, the oldest American society devoted to the history of the book as an object. And the American Trust for the British Library is a little younger, but it is doing very well in supporting the British Library through donations and programs and trips and many other things. So the three organizations, the Book Club of California, the BSA, and the American Trust, complement each other in a very wonderful way. And so we're very lucky to be able to do that. What I'd like to do first is to thank some of the people who helped create this evening and the two evenings to come. And at the Bibliographical Society of America, the president, Carolyn Duras-Mellish, who's I'm sure known to many of you since she's a curator at the Folger Library, and also the director there, Elizabeth, sorry, I got it backwards. The director there, of course, is Erin McGurl, who is very active and does a great job for the BSA. And then at the American Trust for the British Library, we have the president, the current president, Barbara Shaler, who is probably known to everybody here and who is previous president of the Bibliographical Society of America and very active in many important organizations as a scholar of medieval manuscripts. She's also the former librarian at the Beinecke at Yale. And her assistant, or her full-time director now, is Elizabeth Berkowitz, who's also been very helpful. So we've had a lot of help, but most of all, we've had our own executive director, Kevin Kosick, without whom this wouldn't have happened, and it wouldn't have happened at all in San Francisco. In addition to those organizations, this evening has been promoted by many important groups, three of which I'd like to mention. First of all, the Grolier Club, who has promoted it to its large and very serious membership of bibliophiles. Also, the Federation of American Bibliographical Societies, which is the president of which at the moment is my very good friend, Jennifer Larson, and she has promoted it among all of the book collecting societies and bibliophile societies in this country and abroad. And then to my pleasant surprise, Francois Bossat, who is a bookbinder in Brussels and the secretaire, which is a little more than the secretary of the Royal Society of Bibliophiles of Belgium, has also helped promote this evening's events. So we are very fortunate. We have a wide range of support. And now we move to the most important event, and that is our speaker for tonight. In August of 2018, Paul Chernowski kindly agreed to show some of his books, the actual books, in person to a meeting of the Grolier Club in San Francisco. And he asked if we could do it at our house, my wife Eleanor and my house here in San Francisco, because it was more centrally located than where he lives in the East Bay. And we agreed. And then he came to the house, parked his very modest car in front of the house, and proceeded to bring in what I estimated to be about $3 million worth of books, early English books, in cardboard boxes. It was breathtaking. And we have a large dining room. We have a large dining table. It seats 14, and it was not big enough for the books. So he was kind enough to use an additional table and gave a wonderful presentation. So at that time, he showed books from Wynkyn de Worde, the successor to William Caxton, and many other wonderful things that he has given since, many of them to the William Andrews Clark Library at UCLA. So California is the beneficiary of Paul's marvelous collection. He began by reading Shakespeare and Cervantes in high school. Although he was not a book collector, he was a coin collector. Like many of us, we collected something before books. And he was interested in science, especially astronomy. And then he got a PhD. Now, in the world of rare books, among book collectors, there are people who are brain surgeons, rocket science, and some are nuclear physicists. Well, Paul is our nuclear physicist. And after that, he did a postdoc at the University of Maryland and another one at Texas at Austin. And then he went to work at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he still is. Began collecting books in 1985 and became interested in early English books and has been collecting them. Now, for those of you who don't collect early books, you have no idea how difficult it is, not only expensive, but difficult it is to collect English books before the death of Shakespeare, that is, before 1616. They are the most coveted books in the world in some ways, because the number of people who want books in English far exceeds the number of people who want books in any other language or collection of languages. So he's interested in the 16th century in England, and that he has a deadline date of 1616. That is when Shakespeare could no longer have read them, since he was dead. And then he decided to give his books to the Clark Library at UCLA, the William Andrews Clark Library, which is one of the great repositories and is even better since Paul started giving books to them. He's a member of the Grolier Club, and he is also a benefactor of the British Library. So the connection between Paul and the three organizations that have sponsored this talk is quite strong. And he's here tonight to talk to us about the books he has donated and the books he has collected.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Drew. I'm just going to get started. I think we have to, let's not waste time on this. Is this working? It's not working.
No, it's gonna work, watch.
Oh,
Now you're good.
okay,
Now it'll
all right. The books I'm talking about today are all at the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library, which is in Los Angeles. William Andrews Clark made his money mining copper in Montana. He was also a senator from Montana for a while. He also made more money building trolley car tracks in Los Angeles. And his son inherited the money and founded the library. He donated the library to the Regents of University of California in 1526 or 1926, 1526. I got my centuries mixed up here. In 1926, just as the University of California at Los Angeles was being established as that. In fact, the construction started at the Westwood site the next year. What William Andrews Clark Jr. collected, what he started collecting were books, English books in the 16th century, and he got a goodly number of very important foundational books. But he realized he was competing against Folger and Pierpont Morgan in collecting these things, and he very smartly switched to after the English Civil War, the Restoration period and later, and built up a wonderful collection of 17th and 18th century books. So that's what the library is most known for. So what my donation did was fill out the earlier period somewhat, which is nice because that's basically the foundation of modern England during that period, and the English language. So that's why I think it helps the library greatly. This all started when my favorite book dealer, and I'll mention a name at the time, was Ben and Lou Weinstein at Heritage Bookshop in Los Angeles, showed me a copy of Holinshed's Chronicles, and it was about 1990, December of 1990. And that book is a principal source of Shakespeare's history plays. And I took the time and read the book and acquired something on the order of 150 more books that have been donated to the Clark Library. And as I note on the slide here, this copy happened to belong to John Barrymore. Now, the book is different from the second edition because it includes a lot of illustrations, and they're very anachronistic. This is a picture from the history of Scotland, and it's Banquo and Macbeth meeting the three witches, all dressed up in their Sunday morning fine wear to go to church, I suspect. This is the sort of illustrations that were in the book. They did not exactly match the times, but they help the readers enjoy the book. One thing I really liked about it, and I think it's sort of a theme for the collection, is a tip-in that was on the first page inside the book. Let me read it to you. First copies of this book and the first edition of Foxe's Book of Martyrs are the greatest rarity. though imperfect specimens are occasionally met with. This is also the case with the first edition of Shakespeare. The reason is that these three books and the folio of Gentleman's Recreation form the principal studies of the country gentlemen in the 17th century. Those good old books were usually to be found on the table, the window seat, in the great bay windows halls of our ancestors, in those Elizabethan houses that are the pride of our land. Constant reading wore out these books, and their imperfect remains contain commonly such stains of wine, crumbs, and cheese and scribbling that they have been thrown away as worthless rubbish by our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Peace be with them. And I think that sort of catches the spirit of the collection. Let me take a little bit of a time out here. And for those of you that aren't as versed in English history as I've become, and show you what I'm talking about. My books sort of cover what I call the long 16th century. Printing started about 1480 or so, and as Drew mentioned, I sort of had a cutoff of about 1610 or 1620. If you look at the top, what happened is we transformed from a feudal England, late Middle Ages, to an early mercantile society. At the bottom, I've got some key events. The Gutenberg Bible was in the 1450s. Columbus, 1498, as you know, the Battle of the Spanish Armada, and then Jamestown is founded in 1608. So that's sort of a timeline of history. Before the period was the 100 Years' War in Europe, then the War of Roses, which was divided England very badly. Then came the Tudor dynasty, the English Reformation, and we get to Queen Elizabeth and King James. In terms of writing, we have Chaucer well before the period. Then Caxton, as I'll talk more about, really established the modern English language with his printing. Then we go through the Tyndale Bible, what I'll refer to as the drab period, and talk more about. And then we get to Shakespeare and the King James Bible. So it's sort of the period from Caxton to the King James Bible that are the period of the books that I'll be talking about. Now, I'll start out really at the beginning, and that was William Caxton as a printer. I think it's not too much of an overstatement to say that we speak Caxton's English. The language pretty much froze at that point. If you take the time and look at it carefully and read Caxton's printed books and overlook the spelling and the lousy syntax by modern standards, it's very readable English. This book I managed to acquire. It's called The Cordial of the Last Four Things, and it's about the death, last judgment, hell, and heaven. Caxton actually started printing in his Middle Ages, which is kind of late ages in those days. He was governor of the merchants in Bruges, and started printing at about the age of 50, set up shop in Westminster when he was about 55 years old, and printed for about 15 years, issuing about 100 books, about a quarter of which he translated himself. He was not only a printer, he was a translator, he was a writer, and he was an editor. So he contributed a lot. I want to show you one little detail here. This is a close-up of some of the printing. As you can see, printers had the advantage of they could make a lot more copies than scribes. But for a while, they were competing with the scribes as to the beautiful beauty of the script. That went away after a period. But this was very challenging for for typesetters. What we have here is a marginal note, and the note on the left margin there is by the original owner that gives a curse to anybody who steals the book. It says the person should be hanged who steals it, and it ends with God bless King Edward at the end of it, which had to be Edward the Fourth, or maybe even Edward the Fifth, the young one. But it's a signature that's contemporary with the publication of the book. His successor was Wynkyn de Worde, who worked in a shop for a while. This is probably the finest book that I purchased of the early books. It's called The Flower of the Commandments, and it's an exposition on the Ten Commandments, telling what good things happen if you obey the commandments, and how you're going to get into trouble if you don't. It was probably used by clerics to prepare sermons. There are a lot of good stories in there. It was very inspirational for lay readers. The title page has the Ten Commandments written, and they're basically in a doggerel form. It doesn't quite rhyme, but close to it. And the verso of that page is the illustration on the right there, which is one of the finer illustrations in an early English book. Now, I'm biasing this talk a little bit. I've been a lot of talks where people show lots of title pages where you can read the titles to books. I've largely picked books that have illustrations in them, which are sort of unusual for English books, to give you a little bit more to look at rather than simply words on the page. And this is an example of that. One important feature of this book is the inside covers of the books. The doublures were actually pieces of the original binding of the book. That by the tooling and on the covers, they can tell it was the work of what is the person who's known as the Caxton bookbinder. And there are something on the order of 35 copies of his works known, and very few of them are as large as these cover pieces. On the right is Wynkyn de Worde's printer's mark, and it's basically a tribute to William Caxton. The reason why the sun's at the top is his shop was, he moved the shop from Westminster, where Caxton set up, to London on Fleet Street, which might mean something to you older folks that remember how much that's identified with printing. And his shop was at the sign of the sun. So this is his printer's mark. One other thing from the book I wanted to show you, and this is a bit of demonstration that you can read English of that period. Now, one thing that's a little tricky at the end, if you look at the last line on the right there, it says, "But deliver us from evil, amen." Now, I have to help you read it in two ways. One is that the U's and V's were not distinguished in printing. And both of them appeared as V's if they were at the start of the word, and U's if they were in the middle of the word. So you see us there with a V, and evil there with the U in there. The other trick you have to pick up is that typesetters had lots of problems setting type. And one trick they had was to put a mark called a macron on top of a vowel. And what that means is that there's a letter N or M after that letter, which is not printed. So your amen there is A-M-E with a bar over it. So you've got to pick up that trick if you try to read early English books. I'm going to show one other book of Wynkyn de Word's. This one's called Pilgrim of Perfection. It carries the same kind of theme as The Flower of the Commandments. Two interesting points about it is one, this is a book in its original binding, oak board binding. And the second thing is it had 3 fold-out woodcuts in there. My copy only has 2.5 of them, but there are very many copies with none of them. It's not certain whether they're taken out or put in special copies or what, because they don't exactly fit in with the text in the area around it. But all the lettering you see on there is not letterpress, it's cut into the wood block. So this is the closest thing to a block book that was printed in England. And Hodnett, the classical reference on early English printed, noted that and made a special point about this book. One other printer of the period who was equally important was Richard Pinson. They're not sure where he was trained. He might have worked in Wynkyn de Word's or in Caxton's shop. He might have learned to print elsewhere. But he was a high quality printer to King Henry VII and Henry VIII. He printed on the order of several hundred books, but most of his printing was not in English. He printed very few books in English. He mostly printed textbooks, which were in Latin at the time, legal books, and religious texts. This happens to be one of his few printings of English literature from before. John Lydgate in the 16th century was thought of almost as highly as Chaucer. Lydgate, Gower, and Chaucer are often mentioned in the same sentence as found early English writers. This book has 7 woodcuts in it at the start of each chapter. And the only reason why they're such high quality is that this book was printed before in France, and he got the woodcuts from the French printer. This is very high quality woodcuts for an English book this early. And what the woodcut shows, the book is about the fall of princes. And what this is Lady Fortune with a wheel of fortune showing the rise of people and fall of people as the wheel turns. This is a fine book of Pinson's. One other book he printed in English, and I'm not showing a title page, but a page out of the middle of the book here, is the English translation of Froissart's Chronicles of the 100 Years' War. Now, this is an important translation. It was about as quality of English, the same high quality of English as Tyndale's translation of the Bible that I'll mention a little bit later. But I'm showing this because of the signature at the bottom. The original owner of the book signed it at the bottom in the middle of the book, partly to be able to challenge somebody if they stole the book. And if that particular page were torn out, that would be rather unusual. So it might have been a bit of a security measure to sign somewhere in the middle. It's signed, this is Jane Southampton Books. Now, who she was married to Thomas Worsley, who was the Earl of Southampton, the first Earl, and the third Earl of Southampton was actually Shakespeare's patron. Now the family went through some hard times between the first generation and the third generation, but that book might have still been around in the Southampton Library, and it's very possible that Shakespeare picked it up and browsed through it at some point. I don't know. We can fantasize on a lot of things, and that's one of my fantasies. In any case, this is a very nice copy of the book. It was part of the Booth collection around the year 1900 or so, and I have not seen formal documentation of this, but I understand that William Randolph Hearst owned it sometime after that. So this is a nice copy of an important book. I'll show another one here. This is not a William Caxton book, but it's a book he translated, and it's the third edition. Caxton printed the first two, and this is actually rarer than the first or second edition, but obviously it isn't anywhere near as important. It's titled The Mirror and Description of the World, and that's what it is. It's basically what is sort of the first science book printed in English. And this particular edition has some augmentations from the original one. There's a very curious attempt to explain how to take the square root of a number in there. And I think the person who it was probably written in Latin, and the person who translated it didn't know what he was talking about. So it's a rather garbled explanation. They also have an explanation of how the ancients managed to have such good memories, and but it's a fun book. It's highly illustrated. The woodcuts are not the same as in the Caxton edition. They're somewhat later. And the one shows here shows some actual real science. It shows solar and lunar eclipses. But there are fanciful things in the book. And here are two examples of it. On the left, you see the four majors of the rivers of the world, including the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing out of the Garden of Eden. And the second one is titled for to know where hell standeth and what thing it is. So it's a depiction of hell. So illustrations were used for good purposes in those days. There were also books that came in from abroad that were printed abroad, and this is an interesting example. It's quite a rare book, and it's an unusual book. It's called Dialogues of Creatures Moralized, which is a long way of saying fables. And it's a collection of fables that originated in 14th century Italy, 122 of them, and the book has an illustration for each. This book was printed in many languages, and English was about the last one, and it was printed in 1530 in Antwerp. And there's some discussion, and it's uncertain who actually printed it. But it's a beautiful book, highly illustrated. The fable on the left is the lion and the eagle making a deal to divide up the earth into two realms, which each of them will share. One is the land, and the other is the sky. And some of the animals and some of the birds are pretty happy with that. Some of them are kind of grumbling about who their leaders are. The fables were followed by kind of long stories of things people might use in sermons explaining them. They even refer to some of the Aesop's fables. What's interesting about this book also is that it's almost never been reprinted since then, except the Allen Press did an edition of this book, using modern woodcuts in it. And the person who translated the book originally, his English is very rude. And the Allen Press edition cleaned up the English a little bit, but kept it sort of sounding like 16th century English. So it's not exactly the original. And then they cut out some of the long explanation material after the fables. But it's interesting that they found the book and reprinted it. Next comes the Reformation and the English Bible. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the Reformation itself or the English humanists before that, Thomas More and his circle of people. They're well represented in the collection, but I do want to talk about two Bibles in particular. The one on the left is sort of a late printing, 1551, of Tyndale's version of the New Testament. He completed the translation, and the first printing of it was in 1525. It was printed on the continent, and copies were smuggled into England. It turns out that the church bought a lot of the copies coming in because they just bought them and burned them. So there aren't many surviving copies of the early Tyndale New Testament or the later the Bibles. Tyndale was executed in 1536, and just before that, the Archbishop of Canterbury convinced the King Henry VIII, that we ought to have an authorized English version of the Bible. So it's rather ironic that he was killed just about the time that the English English nation was willing to accept the Bible translated into English. The first official authorized version of the Bible in England was the Great Bible. Coverdale had an edition slightly before that. And this book was printed in very large numbers. There were about, if I remember right, 7 editions that came out over a period of 3 years. And what they wanted to do was to have every large church in England have a copy of the book, so readers could go in and read it, and actually probably read it aloud, because not everybody was able to read, but so people could hear the Bible in English. This is, I think it's the 6th edition, printed in 1541. The first 1541. The first printed edition of the English Bible was 2 years earlier. But it's a very nice book and an important Bible. And if any of you want to read a fine Bible other than the King James, I highly recommend you get a copy of the Tyndale Bible. You'll have a little trouble with the spelling, but it's a very competent translation. I mentioned the drab period, and this is the term that C.S. Lewis used, describing sort of the period from about 1540 to about 1570 or so. And what happened, there wasn't much of any literary value written in that period, except for the religious works. Some of the sermons might have some value, but there wasn't much literature produced. So what some printers do are to step back in time and pull out some old classics and reprint them. For those of you that are familiar with the period, the English translation of Ship of Fools by Barclay, which was first issued about 1510, was reprinted in 1570. So people look back. Now, one of the stranger look backs was this book by Stephen Hawes, which Lincoln to Word printed twice, and there are only 3 copies of the two printings that exist, and I think none of them are fully complete. And it was republished again in the 1550s with the original woodcuts. It's a strange story. Hawes was a gentleman in the court of Henry VII, and he wrote poetry. It wasn't very good poetry, but he wrote it. He looked back in time and tried to do an example of a French chanson de geste in English. And the book starts out with a young man walking down a path that has a fork in the road where Lady Fortune is standing, and he gets to make the choice whether he wants to head up the contemplative life or the active life, and he decided to take the active life. And he was directed to a castle where he was supposed to learn the 7 sciences. And he met a beautiful young lady there, and they fell in love. And she had to, for some reason, go back to her parents' castle far, far away. So he finished the studies and became a knight. And then it's all about his adventures, getting to the castle to meet his beloved. And the picture shown here is his encounter with the 3-headed dragon. So those are the kinds of adventures he went through to get there. One interesting thing about this copy, it was owned by Thomas Gray, the famous 18th century poet. And I think the reason why he bought it, he has a few marginal notes in there, is near the end of his life, he was starting to write a history of English poetry. And he bought this book. I think he read through it because there are occasional markings. He really only noted where John Lydgate was noted, because the Hawes was a big fan of John Lydgate, and also he marked down and described some of the obscure words that were in there. But at any rate, this was a fun book to add to the collection. Looking back in time. Another example of that is there were a number, not that many, early printings of Mallory's Morte Arthur in England. William Caxton did the heavy-duty editing of the book and first printed it. I think there were like 4 publications, the last one in 1529. And then in the late 1570s to early 1580s, there were 3 editions of it put out. The copy I got, and all of these editions, the early ones are impossible in the marketplace. These are very rarely come up. And the copy I had all the woodcuts in it, but it was missing 10 leaves. And the illustration I show here was actually also in the book I just showed you. The same printer used it, and it's a wonderful depiction, and it's nowhere mentioned the story of Sir Lancelot fighting a dragon. It's not mentioned in the story, but the woodcut's available, so go ahead and use it. The prologue of the book was missing the title page, but the prologue was Caxton's prose summary of the 9 worthies, 3 of them Christian, 3 of them ancient, and 3 of them pagan. And I can't name them all. I think the 3 Christian ones are King Arthur, Godfrey of Boulogne, and well, I don't remember the 3rd, but I'll think of it later. But at any rate, take a close look at the prologue there, and let me show you the next slide. I had the book rebound. I wanted it was in an ugly binding, and I wanted the facsimile pages. And the person who did the work was Bernard Middleton, who was the preeminent Restoration English bookbinder in the late 20th century. He did a wonderful job on it, and look how well the fake title page, if I can go back, can I go back? Let me try. Yeah, matches the first page in the book. He just did such a marvelous job, both in the facsimiles. The hard thing for him was finding good paper to use. He made copperplate engraving plates to had to find a special ink to make it, and such a beautiful binding. It's a real treasure to have that book. The drought period did have some interesting things. These are two works by a Welsh mathematician who taught at Oxford. His name is Robert Greene. The book on the left is just one page, and I'll say a little bit more about it, of a book on basic arithmetic, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. I think you obviously understand the way they did the addition and subtraction. The multiplication, you have to look at it a little bit before you figure out what they're doing. It's almost as impossible for me to describe how they did long division. I really stared at it for a while and couldn't quite figure it out. But this book went through many editions. I think there were about 20 editions in the 15th century or in the 16th century of this book. And there are very, very few copies of any of them, only one or two surviving copies. I think there's one other copy of this particular edition from 1579, and this book happened to be in the original binding, which is quite beat up, but to get a book that rare in its original binding is quite a treat. The book, the illustration on the right is a more interesting thing in a way. He issued a second book about 10 years later, where he started explaining algebra. And the important thing is, and every reputable source recognizes this, he's the person that invented the equal sign. So the two long bars you see there, both the plus signs and the minus signs, but the two long bars you see there are the first printed equal signs. He got his name in history for that reason. It's a very interesting book. He does a lot of other things in the book, but this was an important treat. Next, I'll show a bit of Queen Elizabeth, and this is a letter she signed. It is a letter commanding Lord Pageant to be part of her honor guard at the Order of the Garter ceremonies in Windsor Palace that year. He worked for all the monarchs from Henry VIII through Queen Mary, and retired in poor health when Queen Elizabeth stepped up. Let me go on to Protestant England. This is the first edition of the Book of Martyrs, which is a highly influential book. It's monstrous in size and monstrous in importance. This is a 14-inch tall book, and that's how large it was. The dedication is shown there. It shows Queen Elizabeth and three important people that made the book possible. William Cecil, who ordered it to be printed. John Day, the printer, and John Foxe, the author. What was important about the book is it had a lot of illustrations in it. And the illustrations were all the gruesome things that they did to the Protestant martyrs. Up on the right there is William Tyndale being garroted. And then at the bottom is a gentleman who's getting his hand burned with a candle, who was later executed. The book is full of this stuff, and for English readers who very rarely saw those illustrations in books, this was a very, very powerful book.
Mind just mentioning what he's saying?
Oh yeah, let me go back. That's a good point.
I haven't memorized it.
Why don't you say it then? I'm
think he's
having
saying,
trouble getting back. I think open the eyes of the king, something of that sort.
God, please open up the eyes of the king.
Yeah. Okay. There were also books to teach astrology. This started getting me hooked. I really got interested in books on learning to do things, and this is one that taught you astrology. And it was an important book, translated from the Clauderia wrote in Latin in France, translated in English and many other languages. Witchcraft was also a topic, and this is a copy of Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, and in which book he completely tore down the notion of witchcraft, both really blaming the people that believed in it. And he said there were really three types of people that got accused of being witches. One were the old ladies that were living alone that people hated for some reason or other. The other are the real bad folks that claimed they had powers and really didn't. And the third group were the magicians that were just good entertainers. And to demonstrate that they were simply entertainers and not really magicians doing real magic, he went through and demonstrated in the book how some magic tricks are done. He consulted a French magician and learned how to do some magic tricks, and showed how they were performed.
Quick question. Was there an English translation of Malus Maleficarum?
No, not really. Okay. A problem in England at the time, they had two kinds of problems. One were vagrant soldiers roaming the countryside as highwaymen, and the other were con artists, which were called coney catchers. Coney being a stupid sort of bird. I got examples of two things here. One is a proclamation by the Queen made the year after the Spanish Armada, Battle of the Spanish Armada, because there were a lot of soldiers that were roaming the countryside then, saying they had to get passports and stay near where the town where they lived, or else they had the danger of being hanged. On the other hand, it was rather gracious in the sense that it said all veterans coming back should be able to get their jobs back, and those that are coming back wounded, it's up to the principality to provide for them. So it had a kind aspect to it, together with the damning aspect. The second thing there is a later book. It's by Thomas Dekker. It was written about 2 decades after Robert Greene's famous books on coney catching, which he published right before Shakespeare came to the stage. But a lot of the tricks in there are explained. One example of which was that there were horse traders at the big fair, every Bartholomew fair every year. And one of the tricks they pulled was to bring the old nags to the fair and stuff their noses with horseradish beforehand so that they'd be nice and lively and they could sell the horses. There are all sorts of tricks like that in there. And in his introduction, I say it in the slide there, he ends the introduction with the line, read and laugh, read seriously and get knowledge. So it is both to entertain people, but also to warn them about the dangers of the countryside. Another interesting facet of life is music in England. And there are two books I'm highlighting here. The first on the left is Musica Transalpina. And what this was Robert Young took a collection of English madrigals, which are very popular in 16th century Italy, and translated the lyrics into English for the English reader and the singers. And the madrigals became very popular, and that set off the madrigal craze in England. And the second part of the book is a collection of Robert Morley's first collection of his madrigals. This is just the basis part, but it's an example of interest in music. As for London, it's interesting. There's only one printed map of London in Queen Elizabeth's era, and that was in this book by John Norton, who was a cartographer. He intended to write books on small books on each county in England, but got outpaced by William Camden on that. But a lot of his maps ended up in Camden's great books. But this is a map of London. You're not going to be able to see it from here, but the Rose Theatre and the Bear Garden are in Southwark, as you expect. The Rose was the theater where Christopher Marlowe's plays were performed. The Lord Chamberlain's Company, their theater is off the map to the north. They were out in the suburbs where they could perform. The second thing is a book on all the nobility created since the time of William the Conqueror. There's about 50 leaves with 5 shields on each of the pages, close to 500, all hand-colored and handwritten. Every manuscript of this sort is unique, but there's a very close cousin at the Walter Museum in Baltimore that was owned by the Spencer family. So at both nobility and London. A bit of humor here: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is an early edition of Christopher Marlowe and Chapman's Hero and Leander, which I think is the best thing that Marlowe wrote. The bad is a really awful sort of book that got burned in the pyre in Don Quixote's courtyard. It's titled The Famous Renowned History of the Worthy Illustrious Knight Mervyn, son to the rare and excellent mirror of and so forth. I won't read the whole thing to you, but it was basically Mervyn was a son of one of Charlemagne's worthies that got lost in a voyage back from the Crusades and landed on this mysterious isle where the queen was Morgan Le Fay's, King Arthur's half-sister, and they had a son, and that's Mervyn, and he went out and conquered Jerusalem and Babylon and all sorts of other great acts. The Ugly is a piece of satire that John Marsden wrote, Scourge of Villainy. And a year later, this book and others like it were subject to a public burning in London, sponsored by the mayor of London and the Archbishop of Canterbury. They did not like satire. I won't read this all to you, but it starts out with a parody of a familiar phrase: a man, a kingdom for a man. And it goes on until all men have hearts of swine, and they're all evil and all the rest, and everybody should repent, and so on and so on. But that's some humor. Mention of a couple sources for Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet was in the novella was in the book called Palace of Pleasure, which is a collection of such things. About 150 novellas that were translated from Italian and French, about 40 of which got to the stage in some fashion or other. The book on the right is, you're not going to be able to see it very well, but it's a copy of John Florio's translation of Montaigne into English. And the bottom line there are some penciled in, inked in corrections, actually by John Florio. And this particular copy was probably given to one of the ladies to which the book was dedicated. So this is hand corrected by the translator, who was undoubtedly a close acquaintance of Shakespeare. Let me end and just mention what's in the collection of Shakespeare in print at the Clark Library that I donated. Top of the list is a book called England's Parnassus that was published in the year 1600. So this is contemporary with Shakespeare. And Parnassus is, in this sense, is a collection of great poetry, great poets or great poetries. And everybody can name in Shakespeare's time has little snippets of their work in there, including something, I don't remember the number, something like on the order of 80 pieces from early Shakespeare plays and his poems, often not more than just a few lines. But that's Shakespeare in print in his lifetime. The second one is what's referred to as a bad quarto. It's actually two plays together, merged into one, Henry VI, part 2 and 3. That was printed in 1619, and it was basically a rogue printing. They probably didn't have the printing rights for the books, but they published a number of Shakespeare plays. And it looks like they were both distributed individually and bound together. So there are bound copies of about, I don't remember the number, 10 to 20 plays, a number of which are not Shakespeare's, but were thought to be Shakespeare's, that were put together before the first folio. Then from the first folio, I did manage to get a copy of the play Henry VIII. Had a copy of the second folio. It's the one that's illustrated in the announcement of this. If you look at the announcement closely, the bottom half of the portrait looks a little different than the top half. And the reason for that is the bottom half is a pen and ink facsimile of the portrait. The book really only has half the original title page, and the rest of it is just an excellent ink filling in the bottom portion of the picture. I had one play from the third folio, and had one of the finest copies of the fourth folio. Probably none better, except you would like to have the book in the original binding. This was rebound. That was really the only fault of the book. It was owned by, it came from the Carysfort Castle, is owned by the Houghton. It's actually mentioned and described in Rosenbach's book about the biography of him, is the wonderful copy that Houghton ended up with. And just in case you're interested, if you want more information about the collection, and there's an excellent bibliographic description of it in the UCLA Library Catalog. And since I have such an unusual, not that unusual, but a rather odd last name, you could go to the UCLA Library Catalog, type in my last name, and do a sort by date ascending, and there aren't many people writing books or scientific papers before the 1600 or so. So about the first 150 entries will be books that I donated. And they're very excellent descriptions. Nina Schneider, the rare book librarian there, did a wonderful job cataloging the books. You can also look at the Clark webpage, which has information on the collection. And when STC comes back up, British Library is having some problems with everything right at the moment. You can look in the short title catalog. Again, type in my last name, and you'll be able to see what other institutions around the world hold copies of the books that I have, or had, I should say. At any rate, that's what I wanted to tell you today. I think I ran a bit over, but we started a bit late. And I hope you, I went out of my way to show you a variety of books and not just mention one Shakespeare source book after another. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Don't go anywhere. We're going to see if we have time for just a couple of questions, because we are past the hour and we'd like to make sure you get home safely. So if there are any questions here in the audience, now would be a time to, yeah, right back there.
Concerning the vagrant soldiers.
Yeah.
Were they vagrant because there was no paid employment between wars of the king? And then the king would go to war and then they get mustered in to be paid again?
Well, it's a complicated issue because they had no standing army. So all the lords were ordered to gather a certain number of people to bring with them when they go to war. So they were basically drafted. Every Englishman was an archer, which worked very well up to a certain point of time, but then and a lot of them were pretended vagrants, soldiers. I mean, there were a lot of imitation. I mean, there were just a lot of vagrants those days. I mean,
Sure, let's go right here in the front.
Was there any effort to be consistent in any aspect of English syntax, spelling, anything that might help people read in the same way?
Not really. There were a couple of dictionaries printed, but they were more for the purpose of, they were more of the nature of multi-language dictionaries to show you, give you the English word and give you other languages. Spelling really didn't start getting, I think two things helped in spelling. The first was the issuance of the King James Bible, which is how everybody learned to read at a certain period for centuries. And then after that, I think the next important step was Johnson's dictionary in the 18th century. But no, I mean, in terms of spelling, I mean, you could see the word spelled differently on the same page in books. I mean, it was not really regular at all. But in almost all cases, it's quite phonetic. if you just look at the letter and, you know, try to pronounce it, you're gonna get it right.
That actually leads into one of the questions we have on Zoom, which was from Margaret, which says, what percentage of England were literate in the 16th century?
Oh, boy, that's a totally unanswered question, and it's really rather sad. That's the case all the way across Europe. You know, if I were to guess a number, I would say 20%, something of that sort. However, and also I think the other thing that's surprising is, if you set aside the businessmen who really sort of needed to read, if you go to the royalty, I would not be surprised that if more of the women in the royal families were readers than the men. I mean, the men were out doing their thing, and they were the ones that kept the household and had the time and had to teach the children and all those things. So sadly, it's not an answered question.
It's more than I would have thought.
Yeah. Now, the other question to ask is how many could write, and it's far smaller number than the ones that could read. In part because paper was so expensive. You buy books of that period, and you see a lot of ink and pen trials on the blank pages and books because people had no other paper to practice on.
We have one last question that we're going to take right here. Phil.
For books on the continent, many would have been printed in Latin. And I was fascinated to see so much English printing. Were there books? Were there fewer books printed in Latin in England than on the continent?
Oh yeah, for many reasons. One of which is they couldn't really compete. You know, you can import so many books from the continent that why even try? I think that there were not many, except for Richard Pinson early on. If you get to the mid-century and later, there were not many books printed in England in Latin.
Well, that's all we have time for. So we're going to
Okay.
wrap up. And I'm going to say, if anybody wants the information that is on the slide, I can send that to you afterwards. So if you didn't get a picture of it or jot it down, I'm happy to provide you that information after this evening. Just reach out to me and I'll get it for you. And then I guess on behalf of the Book Club of California, the American Trust for the British Library, and the Bibliographical Society of America, I want to thank you for this incredible presentation. There's lots of great feedback on Zoom about your talk this evening. So thank you so much. Please thank our speaker. And then, of course, we want to thank you for joining us, whether on Zoom or here in the club rooms this evening. As a reminder, for more information about the Book Club of California, you can go to bccbooks.org. For more information about the Bibliographical Society of America, you can go to bibsocamer.org. And for more information about the American Trust for the British Library, you can go to atbl.us. And I can send that out to you as well if you need those URLs. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening and get home safely. Thank you.